Good afternoon to everyone that's joining us. And for those that will be viewing this after the fact, I'm really excited to be here for another webinar in our Freedom Requires Action webinar series, which is hosted by Safe House Project. Today's topic is one that I think a lot of us are very curious about. There's a lot of discussion around the issues of refugees coming into the United States, but also as it impacts other countries, right? Yeah. But then, and also how is illegal immigration impacting this issue of human trafficking? What is the intersectionality that really exists? And so today we're gonna talk about some of the current policies that are out there, some of the things that are impacting at the federal level across the country. Then also very honored to be joined as well by Chris Lim with the Alabama Attorney General's office, who's going to give us some insight into what's happening at the state level. His official title is the Alabama Anti-Human Trafficking Alliance Coordinator with the Alabama Attorney General's office. Chris is an expert in the field of human trafficking. He has worked with victims and survivors of human trafficking and with agencies and organizations that providing victim and survivor support. He's trained service providers and investigators on both sex and labor trafficking. His background includes law enforcement, business management, nonprofit leadership, and is engaged in anti-human trafficking work full-time since 2014. I've met Chris, probably about 2 years ago, and have really just been so impressed and been able to engage him and the work that he's doing in Alabama, really on the forefront of a lot of initiatives of trying to bring folks together and to really address this issue. And Chris, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Yeah. And our second guest is a colleague of many years back, Martina. I won't put a number on that, but Martina Vandenberg is
20. I think 20.
Martina Vandenberg is the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Legal Center. It's an organization dedicated to providing pro bono counsel to trafficking survivors. Martina spent more than 2 decades fighting human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, and violence against women. Martina's represented victims of human trafficking pro bono in immigration, criminal, and civil cases, and has trained more than 5,000 pro bono attorneys nationwide to handle human trafficking members. And I just have to say, Martina, you've really been on the forefront of this for such a long time, really advocating for the legal changes. I know that you've been very active as a practitioner, but also in advocating for legislative changes so that we can make sure that the laws are really effective, right, in the fight to end human trafficking. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of a curveball question in the sense of just if you can frame it for us, Martina, when legislators pass bad legislation, how does that impact our efforts in the field to combat human trafficking?
So bad legislation can have an enormous impact on trafficking survivors' lives. I'll just give the example of potential changes to T visas, for example. The T visa system, in many ways, is working. And it's had some hiccups along the way, and there have been some issues. But sometimes it's a question of figuring out how to take advantage of what's working and tweak it slightly and not redesign it. So I feel like we've made such progress. In 2003, we changed the law so that trafficking survivors can sue their traffickers in federal court. In 2008, we changed the law so there's extraterritorial jurisdiction. So I feel like so many of the amendments that we have pushed over the years have been positive. Bad laws make for bad outcomes for survivors.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important to understand. And Chris, moving to you, I want to also point out that you're not just a pretty face in the human trafficking space, but you're also doing a lot of research and just recently joined the Samaritan Women's Institute for Shelter Care. But I know that in the course of your work in human trafficking, I want to go high level and then we'll bring it back to the US and what we're seeing. You've traveled all around the world. You've done some work in the Philippines, Cambodia, Jordan, Kenya, just in so many different countries. When it comes to issues like migration and immigration, what have you seen in some of these other countries? How have policies impacted what you're seeing in human trafficking in, say, Southeast Asia or East Africa versus what you're seeing, if you could make that comparison to what you're seeing in Alabama?
Hmm. Okay, so first of all, I have to say that I don't think anybody's ever said that I'm a pretty face of anything. Yeah, it's an interesting question because I remember when I was new in anti-human trafficking work and I was working domestically with an organization in Los Angeles. And then I made my first trip internationally to do some work internationally. When I came back, I was just struck by the idea that it, within the vulnerabilities and how we go about as a community addressing human trafficking and some of the victimology of it, when you're talking about labor and sex trafficking, that there obviously are other forms of trafficking that are much different. But in those two instances, there actually are a lot of striking similarities. And so I was struck by that. But when you were posing that question, one of the things that the first picture that came to my mind was in Jordan. When I was in Jordan, there was an IDP camp that was on the Syrian border. It was just on the border of Jordan and Syria. But it's a huge camp, and there was a lot of folks there. And what was happening in just one of the towns that was nearby was girls were being taken from that IDP camp and then brought into this particular town and being trafficked in there. So I think that's probably another example of governments really trying to provide a solution for something, an issue, a problem, and then maybe not thinking through, or maybe it's not even, maybe it's very difficult to think through what are all of the potential unintended consequences, right? And so with that concept in mind, as it comes back to the states, there's probably at least two examples that I can think of that are top of mind. One is in communities. So here in Alabama, for example, there's a lot of rural communities, low-income communities where there's a lot of poverty, and some sectors that are providing job opportunities for people in those areas, whether it's manufacturing or agriculture or whatnot. And I think that in those areas, you can see where migrants are coming in and unbeknownst to them are actually displacing folks that live there in terms of jobs, because unscrupulous managers and that sort of thing would hire them at horribly low rates and that sort of thing instead of paying the residents of those communities. So that is potentially one impact that's bad for the migrants and bad for the folks that live in those communities that had those jobs previously. And then I guess the other example that's top of mind is the influx of unaccompanied minors and the challenges that causes to our systems, right? To our state's child welfare agencies, whether you're here in Alabama or any other state, are being taxed. Their resources are being taxed because they're not able to provide the level of care and support that they need to. Those and the NGOs, actually, probably more so the NGOs that are providing the home studies for them and the after placement support and things like that. And my concern as it relates to that is that when the home studies are not being done, and when the after placement support's not being done, a lot of these unaccompanied minors can be moved around, or it creates vulnerabilities for sure in certain areas for them, where they're not on anybody's radar. They're not on the radar of our education system if they're not enrolled in school, or if they get unenrolled. They're not on the radar of our child welfare agencies unless they're fall under dependency or delinquency in some fashion. And so these kids become ghost kids, and they're not on people's radars, and there's just a lot of vulnerabilities around there that I'm concerned our policies have just increased that.
Yeah.
Bill, can I just jump in? Can I just jump in on that? It's just two quick points. One is, You asked about bad laws, and I was thinking federal, but I have to say the worst laws that are currently under consideration and being passed around the country are laws that are weakening child labor restrictions.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
weakening child labor restrictions just opens the door to all of the harm that children are literally dying at the workplace. There have been investigative journalists finding children cleaning the floors of slaughterhouses in the middle of the night.
Hmm.
So the answer to the labor shortages in the United States is absolutely not what has happened in Arkansas and Iowa and some other states that have passed laws literally weakening child labor laws. On your bigger global question of migration, because when I worked for Human Rights Watch, like we saw the kind of migration issues. What we have learned over the last 20 years is that forced labor is ubiquitous throughout the global supply chain, and
Sure.
that it's not pay to play, it's pay to work. And so you have migrants all around the globe paying unscrupulous labor recruiters and buying a job. And so when they arrive in the United States or when they arrive in Qatar, they already have an enormous debt that they have to service. And so I think the question here is, what are the systemic issues that we need to confront in order to prevent trafficking?
Hmm.
And one of them is this, absolutely, we call it a system, not a bug. It is so common for people to have to purchase jobs. And it's a large problem here in the United States. There's a case currently being prosecuted in Georgia, Operation Blooming Onion, where labor recruiters managed to obtain 71,000 H2A visas and bring agricultural workers into the United States and hold them in forced labor.
Yeah, I think you raised a really good point. I want to start zeroing in on what we're seeing within the states and the impact on the systems. But I want to go and just address something head on, if you will, for us, Martina. There's a lot of conversation around the Southwest border right now and what's happening in the United States. And there seems to be this, in my opinion, conflation of human trafficking and smuggling or illegal migration across the border. Could you comment from your perspective what you have seen on when we look at what's happening on the Southwest border? Is that human trafficking? Is it a precursor to human trafficking? What are we really seeing as it relates to this field?
I think we're seeing people from around the globe fleeing dangerous situations, and everyone has a right of asylum. You have a right to request refugee status. You have a right to request that at the border. And so we're having this conversation on the day that the Department of Justice sued Governor Abbott and the state of Texas for literally setting up barbed wire and 1,000-foot long barrier in the Rio Grande River to try and block migrants from coming in. That, I have to say, is absolutely the worst thing that you can do. Because when you turn your border into essentially a militarized war zone, what you're doing is making it more profitable for smugglers, because the smugglers simply charge more to bring
Mm-hmm.
people in, and you're actually increasing, not decreasing, people's vulnerability to
Mm-hmm.
trafficking. This conflation of smuggling and trafficking is very politically charged. It's what we see the Europeans doing as well. So the Europeans call everyone bringing migrants over on boats to ask for refuge. They call all of those people traffickers. Those are smugglers. They are smugglers. The victim of that is the state. That there's only trafficking if someone ends up in forced prostitution or forced labor. Moving someone across a border is simply smuggling until there is an end game of
Yeah.
exploitation.
No, and I know I appreciate you sharing that. And I know that you've spoken passionately on that issue. And so it continues to be a problem. And as we're seeing individuals coming into the United States, I think you both have talked about the challenge on the systems themselves. And that because of, and it seems like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's agreement here on the fact that our systems are just not set up to be responsive to this. And in essence, at some point, these individuals become vulnerable. They can become targets for trafficking, whether it's labor exploitation or exploitation in the commercial sex trade. but there is a level of vulnerability that exists when they don't have access to specific services. I know a lot of work has been done in Alabama to try to respond to some of these, to boost systems. In particular, Chris, I know that you've done a lot of work on coordinated efforts, trying to get folks to the table to share those different resources. And I wonder if you could share a little bit with us of why having coordinated response models is so important when we're dealing with vulnerable populations.
Yeah, it's essential because of the complexity of the situation that they find themselves in. We're all aware that victims of trafficking have multiple needs, and all of those needs cannot be addressed adequately from one agency, one organization, one individual. And in a best case scenario, I think what a lot of communities and states have tried to do is just hodgepodge it together and bring in whatever resources are available to address things, even if those resources aren't really the best fit or the best organization or agency to deal with it. And that having a collaborated and coordinated effort of all of the different services and all of the different programs that have certain responsibilities and roles and authorities within our community is the best way to address that. And so we are working on one thing, and that I brought up the idea that was top of mind with the unaccompanied minors. And it was top of mind because that's one of the things that we're working on. And so we have, for example, in our state, the number of these children that we're receiving has just exploded over the past couple of years. And I looked at a map of where they're going and noticed that they're really going to about 5 different areas within the state of Alabama. And a couple of those areas make sense. They're big cities, lots of resources that are going to these areas, and they hopefully are well equipped to serve them. But there's some areas that they're going to that are more rural areas with very limited resources. And a lot of these kids are going there, and there's low population centers there, and there's not the infrastructure to support them. And so what we're doing is I've asked a local nonprofit that serves those counties in that area to really start to strategize and brainstorm about how can we pull together the different resources within the community that are needed, that to identify them, to provide services where needed, and then if they're being exploited, to try to mitigate that exploitation, whether it's through education or other services or through law enforcement efforts. And so really taking this comprehensive approach to looking at an issue and trying to figure out what are all of the pieces that we need to address it. All of their needs are not social service and all of their needs are not law enforcement. It's a combination of both and a mixture of stuff in between.
Yeah, I appreciate those efforts because I know a lot of times in these situations that can be somewhat unprecedented, right? Or at least we seem unprepared. You are triaging, and I know that you're doing a great job with the resources that you have. Martina, Chris is talking about what's happening at the state level, right? Obviously, the federal government should and could play a role in supporting these communities, supportive services for refugees that are coming into the United States. What do you think? What are some of if you had to say, what is the policy within the federal government that is having the most positive impact? And then what is the policy right now in the federal government that's having the most negative impact, if you will, if we could be so bold to highlight those?
So I would say at the federal level, the reporting on child labor in these areas, and Chris, these are exactly the areas that you're talking about, that have these factory farms and these slaughterhouses and processing facilities. I think that the investigative journalism from the New York Times completely set a fire underneath the federal government, and there's just a lot more attention being paid to this. And my hope is that the money will also flow, right? Because the states need resources to do the kind of case management that Chris is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The states need resources to provide the kind of wraparound services that these kids need. And in terms of the worst, I think one really troubling case that we saw several years ago was a group of traffickers who brought kids in from Guatemala and put them in horrendous conditions in a mobile home park without running water or heat in the middle of Ohio, in a rural area in Ohio, and then took those kids back and forth to an egg processing plant, and they were held in the egg processing plant and they harvested eggs every day. And so I would say the real lack of accountability is holding the corporations accountable. These children aren't working just anywhere. These children are working in companies. They're working in corporations. And certainly the investigative journalism that we've seen shows that these children are 11. They don't look 35. There's really, no one should be fooled by the idea that these children are actually adults and look adult. They don't. And at this point, the fines meted out to those companies and those corporations far too low. And also, we need to be looking at criminal liability for corporations that engage in or financially benefit from forced labor of these unaccompanied minors. That's where the accountability needs to be. And I think companies could indeed, as Chris says, pay more and hire people who aren't 12. But they have to do that. And if they don't do that, they should be prosecuted if it's forced labor.
Yeah. It is interesting, right? Because there's so many, as in many things, in particular human trafficking, there's impact in so many different ways. In fact, quite ironically, I had a conversation with somebody in my own community this morning about how they run a garage, a repair shop for cars, and some of the other garages in the area are employing these undocumented workers and only paying them $2-3 an hour, which is well below minimum wage here in Virginia. And he says, listen, I've got a problem because they're being exploited. I said, but it's also impacting other businesses. It's impacting the economy as a whole, right? We talk about fair labor standards, right? We need to make sure that everyone is able to meet those cost of living needs. And when you are only paying somebody $2 or $3 an hour, that enhances their vulnerabilities as well, right, within the community, because they have a lack of stability. And we all know from being in the human trafficking space, that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities is lack of stability, right? Whether it comes from war, displacement, instability in the home, whatever the case may be. And so I want to talk a little bit about the victimization component, right? And what are we doing for the survivors? I had the pleasure of working with Chris, actually from the great state of Alabama, former colleague of mine, Darlene Hutchinson at the Office for Victims of Crime. Really taught me a lot about the different programs that we can be implementing at the federal level, right, to support those local efforts. But I would maybe argue, and I would appreciate sort of your insight on this, in my experience with the Department of Justice and just being in this space, the federal government's not investing enough on the victim services side either, right? So I think there are relevant policies and laws to hold folks accountable, right? So we could put that under the prosecution bucket, if you will. I think we've talked a little bit about what we could be doing in the prevention bucket as far as making sure that they have access to work permits and other things, right, that ultimately can make them more vulnerable. But let's talk a little bit about the protection piece, right? Chris, I know that you work for a government agency, so of course you have to be careful in what you say, but could you talk a little bit about, are there things that you think the federal government could be doing more in supporting survivors of exploitation or supporting efforts to create what we like to call exit ramps for those that are in exploitation?
Yeah, and obviously that's where my mind was going, is that are those exit ramps. I think obviously the federal government, we invest, we meaning the us all being part of it, pays, or not pays, but invests a lot of money in anti-human trafficking efforts. And I think that if more of it, or if there was, again, good resource planning around what these off-ramps can look like, I think that would be helpful. I think what we need to avoid is creating and funding these ongoing programs that just create dependency upon the federal government. I think that even the title of this series, Freedom Requires Action, that just brings to my mind that the actions that we take can either create freedoms or can create dependencies. And in that case, they're not truly free, right? And I think that focusing on programs that help them, whether it's through education, whether it's through learning a trade or a craft of some sort, if there are opportunities that they need for even just things like how just basic things like how to have a bank account. And I guess we don't balance checkbooks anymore, but some of these basic life skills that people need. I often think back, and maybe I'm weird and nerdy about this, but I think back to emancipation, right? And when that happened, there was the Freedmen's Bureau that was created by President Lincoln at the time to do this very thing, right? Hey, we have a group of people here that are newly freed that have a ton of disadvantages because they were enslaved. So what are these basic things that they need in order to be able to have a successful living? And I think there's probably some learning lessons there and some similarities that we can do in the anti-trafficking space through federal government support in the NGO world or different things to support programs or to encourage the creation of programs that would have that sort of impact on their lives.
Bill, if I could just jump in on that one and be completely blunt,
Please.
freedom requires money.
Yeah.
Freedom requires housing. And so I think, Chris, while I agree with you longer term, I think we've missed a step because we have survivors who can't get a lease. They don't have a work authorization because they can't get continued presence from the federal government. They can't work. We're anticipating that they are supposed to live on air and fumes under bridges. The funding is so stingy to support survivors. I don't see a lot of that money getting to survivors. The budget line items are incredibly low. We had one case where we don't do social services and we don't take federal money. We are completely funded privately. And we're lawyers. We're supposed to be a legal services organization, but we work with partner organizations for the social services piece. And I was flabbergasted when I discovered that someone who had no housing, who had no work authorization because she couldn't get continued presence, who had no source of income whatsoever. She was told by the federally funded agency that was supposed to put her in the flagship support program for trafficking survivors that she would get $300 a month. $300 a month for food, for housing, for every single need that she had. $300 a month. On what planet is that acceptable? So when people first escape from their situation, if we're not going to give them a work authorization, if we're not going to let them actually try and earn money, then we actually have to provide for their basic needs. It is a moral obligation to provide for their basic needs. And at this point, I don't know anyone in any part of the country who could live on $300 a month.
I think that's a good point, just marrying the two comments here. And I think that is, when we look at what are the services that we are providing to survivors, they need to be more comprehensive. We've got to go beyond if I could be so direct, and to say we've got to go beyond just the emergency shelter type scenarios and looking at long-term care that provides educational opportunities, or whether it's vocational training or ongoing education in some sort of way. But you are right, Martina, right? Freedom does require investment in this space. It's a $150 billion enterprise, as the folks will tell us. And we're investing, what's the line item? DOJ gets maybe 75 million a year, and they're the largest from a domestic investment standpoint, right? So I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that kind of comes to this idea of why we're doing this webinar series, right? And when we talk about this idea of freedom requires action, Martina, you are a powerful advocate. Chris, you're a powerful advocate. You both are great practitioners. But I think it really requires the whole of the movement to come together and advocate for change. Looking back at the last reauthorization of the TVPA, Martina, I know you were involved in that process and in helping to get that thing through. We fought that for how long? 2 years. It should have been a no-brainer. There was nothing overly controversial in that particular bill, but it lacks the priority of our government, of our elected officials to really move things forward in a meaningful way. But yet we're all willing to stand up and say, second largest criminal enterprise, greatest human rights violation of our day. But we're not taking the necessary action to really bring about the change that we need. So I think that we've probably hit on a lot of different things. But Martina, I wonder if you could share, if you had an opportunity to address the whole of Congress today, what is it that you would tell them is the number one priority when it comes to addressing the exploitation and trafficking of our immigrant and refugee populations here in the United States?
So I would hammer home the funding issue. I think it's funding for states like Alabama to provide the prevention services for children who are there. It's funding for the Department of Labor. We have really put all our eggs in the Department of Justice basket, but last year the Department of Justice prosecuted 7 forced labor cases in the entire country. So we need to actually rethink this and put resources in the hands of the Department of Labor and the Wage and Hour Division. It's actually the Department of Labor that identified the child labor exploitation and violations that were going on around the country. So I think we need to ramp up the resources really astronomically, but then also be much more strategic about where we're putting the money.
Yeah. I want to build on that just for a second, because I agree with you. I think we need the investment that needs to be going into services, of course, but I also think that we need the investment into the executive branch, right? Because there is, particularly with labor trafficking, I'm glad that you highlighted that, particularly with labor trafficking, there does not seem to be the energy behind investigating and prosecuting those cases. And I think, and if you'll excuse me for framing it this way, those cases just aren't as sexy as sex trafficking. And so we don't see that investment. We even see that at the state level. So I'll take Virginia, for example. While Virginia was one of the last states to get a sex trafficking statute in the criminal code, it still does not have a labor trafficking statute. And oftentimes these labor violations are either settled as civil issues, or they go completely undetected because there is just not the resources to be able to investigate and coordinate. I think that's a really key point. And Chris, so Martina said what she would tell us in front of Congress. If you were standing in front of all of the human trafficking advocates, those that are working in the field, that are serving survivors, doing prevention education, oftentimes those advocates are not communicating and not doing what Martina just did and addressing Congress. They're not addressing our federal government or any of these other folks. What would you say to those practitioners that are out there? You've seen it, right? You've been a practitioner, you're a researcher, you're dealing with policy at the same time. What would you tell those advocates that really want to see change and really identify a lot of challenges that we're seeing?
You're trying to get us all in trouble, aren't you?
Absolutely.
I think that in terms of the advocates, I guess I would say 2 things. One is to not lose their vision and their passion, because most of these organizations and individuals that are involved with this, they start with that, right? And then once they get into the work and they realize how challenging it is, that kind of might dissipate a little bit. But the second thing I would say, though, is I think a partner to that is professionalize, for lack of a better word, your processes and your work. We're at a time where it's always been a time, but I think right now people are realizing that there's a lot of advocates out there that are doing good work, but maybe not doing it well. And so I would just encourage folks to maintain both of those, maintain your vision and your passion, but also do your work in a way there's no best practices per se. Right? This is something that we're still learning and developing, and as this field changes, but to not lose their distinctive while they professionalize. I bring that up because there's a challenge. I think, especially in the faith-based sector on both ends, right? So sometimes we're concerned about the faith-based sector in that maybe they're providing services and some are compelling religious activities or things like that. I've not seen that, but that is a concern. But then I don't want them to lose what is motivating them, but I do want them to become professional in what they do. And there's some studies that have been done in the past about 3 years or so that talked about as these faith-based organizations receive funding. And I'm interested in, Martina, it's neat to hear that you don't receive federal funding, because these studies we're talking about, as these agencies and organizations receive federal funding, they become more secularized. And I don't think that's necessarily good or even needed. They just need to do their work in a professional way. And I probably just made a lot of enemies and said that awkwardly, but you know.
No, I think it's a really good point. I think one thing that I'll just add to that is that I think sometimes we operate within our silos, right? Sometimes we get this tunnel vision or say our job is just this, or we're just going to do this over here. And the reality is that for us to truly be effective in this space, I think we all have to come together. I think that we all need to raise our voices collectively and let decision makers know that sometimes they are short-sighted in their policies. Sometimes things that they're implementing can have more harm than it does good. But it's important that we're communicating that, right? Because otherwise we don't know what's happening, or at least the policymakers in DC don't know what's happening. When I was at the Department of Justice, I used to tell my colleagues and folks that I worked there, I said, look, in DC, we're operating in a bubble, right? And we don't know what's happening in the quote real world unless we get out and we talk to folks. And I think it's so important that your voices are elevated. Everyone in this space is making sure that they have a say at the local, state, and federal level, because they all need to be working together. Martina.
Yeah, Bill, if I could just add though, we need to be listening to survivors. One of the
Of course.
most important things that's happened is the creation of the White House Advisory Council, a survivor advisory council that literally provides policy input and recommendations to the federal government. That's one of the most important innovations that we've seen over the last decade, and it's now taking hold and taking root, and I think it will be replicated in other countries. I certainly hope so. But there's a report that was recently published called We Name It So We Can Repair It. And it is a survivor-written, survivor-led indictment of the anti-trafficking movement and the harm that has been done. Because I think there are cases of compelled religious practice. And there are cases of non-governmental organizations that have used survivors to raise money, but not actually provided any services to those survivors.
Sure.
The survivors in our community are extremely troubled by what they see in the sector. And I think at this point, we need to be listening very closely to the critique that the survivors have raised. We need to be implementing their recommendations, and they need to be really at the table and in every forum. So Bill, the last time you and I saw each other, it was on the Hill at a hearing, and I was testifying, but I was only one of 5 people testifying that day, and at least 3 of the others were survivors.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge shift in the voices we're listening to, and it's completely appropriate and needs to expand.
So I agree with you. I'm going to add a word of caution there, if I may, and that is that we have to be certain that when we convene these survivor councils and advisory groups, that we're not just listening, but we're enacting what they're saying. I certainly am not, to take from Chris, I don't want to make anybody upset or call anybody out, but I've heard from several survivors, particularly, I'm going to be cautious. Now you're going to get me in trouble. But I've heard from individuals that have participated in preparing reports, let's keep it that general, who have said, you know what, we've submitted that report and then the government hasn't listened to it. So what was the point? And I think that I agree with you 100%, Martina. They have to have a seat at the table, but then we as survivor advocates need to advocate that we then listen to that and implement those, right? And make sure that we're working to elevate their voices. And human trafficking is so diverse. It happens in so many different ways. And we're just zeroed in today on one very specific population that's being targeted, but understanding that all those diverse viewpoints need to be heard and need to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and Bill, the sector that's getting it, I think more quickly than most, is the private philanthropy sector. And so we work with foundations. There's one foundation, GFEMS, it's led by a survivor of human trafficking. There's a foundation that we work with, Humanity United. Humanity United has multiple survivors on staff, and these are people with real power. Mm-hmm. So I think there's an enormous shift going on, and the philanthropy sector is ahead of the regular sector, but I completely agree. And when this report came out, we name it so that we can repair it, talking about the harm that's been done. One of the survivors, who was one of the authors, said to me that her greatest fear was that the report would enter the world and no one would read it. None of the recommendations would ever be implemented. So I think that's a real fear. The survivors are speaking, but we have to make sure we're listening and implementing.
I think that those of us that aren't survivors, but have had the privilege to walk along survivors in that journey, have a responsibility to elevate their voices and to make sure that they have a seat at the table. And I love that you mentioned GFEMS, incredible. I've had a couple of conversations with Sophie lately, and just the vision that they have is amazing. And I think it ties into, and I'm gonna protect myself from not going off, because we could have a whole nother discussion around collective impact in the philanthropy space and how that could really be engaged here. I want to give you both just an opportunity, 60 seconds or less, just to give some closing remarks and some closing thoughts. And so, Martina, we'll start with you.
So thank you so much for bringing us all together. And Chris, it's wonderful to meet you. And thank you for the work that you're doing in Alabama to try and sort of prevent trafficking before it starts. I think that's what the hearing that you and I went to was all about, Bill. It was about talking about the forgotten P, which is prevention. Right. And so I think, to the extent we are now pivoting in this movement, we need to direct massive resources to prevention, and we need to target massive resources on helping people actually stabilize after they escape so that they can thrive.
Thank you, Martina. And Chris.
Yeah, and and thank you, Martina, for those kind words. And it is an honor to sit with both of you and hear and learn from you as well. And I guess I would just add to that, include with that, the fact that as a anti-human trafficking movement as a whole, that we need to look at this comprehensively. And you made a comment, Bill, earlier about how labor trafficking isn't as sexy as sex trafficking, and that's the case. We tend to get in our response myopic on either what draws clicks or what brings in dollars, and there's victims in those other spaces that aren't represented. And so I think we need to look at this comprehensively when we're looking at solutions and policy, and realize that there are all of the P's that we need to address. And there's also, when you look at the issue of human trafficking, there's a victim, there is an exploiter, and there is a consumer, right? And our responses and policies need to address all three of those as well. And that's I guess what I would say is let's just make sure that we're making sure that we're addressing this issue comprehensively.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. So I just want to thank you both, two incredible experts in the space that really bring different perspectives to the table. But it was a great conversation to really dig in. So thank you so much for your time. And for those that have joined us, thank you. For those that are watching in perpetuity, thank you for your time. And remember that your voice really does matter, and that you need to be, as we talked about, elevating survivors and also what you're seeing in the field, so that we can bring about real change. So thank you all. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you for the next one.